there may be stuff that we are getting wrong. What I can say with absolute certainty is that there is no agenda.
Well, since October 7, 2023, Israel and the Middle East have dominated international headlines. Their terror attacks, Gaza, Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and now Iran. Now, the BBC, widely regarded as the authoritative voice of Britain around the world, has led the international news coverage of the war since October 7. But accusations of bias against Israel dog the British public broadcaster. For example, in early 2025, the BBC admitted it had broadcast an hour of primetime television narrated by the son of a Hamas terrorist leader. And in June, the White House attacked the BBC's coverage of the Gaza conflict, accusing the broadcaster of taking Hamas's word as total truth.
The BBC, who had multiple headlines, they wrote, "Israeli tank kills 26." And then, oh wait, they had to correct and take down their entire story, saying we reviewed the footage and couldn't find any evidence of anything. Oh, okay.
But here's today's question. How does a devout Jew reconcile his faith and identity with a commitment to impartiality in covering the Middle East? Tim Franks is a longtime presenter of NewsHour on the BBC World Service, and he's a former BBC Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. Tim is author of The Lines We Draw, The Journalist, The Jew, and an Argument About Identity. That's published by Bloomsbury. Tim, welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies.
Great to see you, Tom, and thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Just summarise succinctly, what is your book about?
I'll do it as succinctly as I can. The book was born out of my farewell. We've got a program called From Our Own Correspondent, which is just the correspondent in a region just talking for a few minutes in a sort of dispatch, a rather old-fashioned dispatch that they send through to London. And I did a valedictory one. I did a farewell one from my posting in Jerusalem after my 3.5 years there as Middle East correspondent. And in that, I confronted what a lot of people had said in the run-up to my appointment, during my time as Middle East correspondent, and indeed, I have to say, in the years since as well, which is the fact that I am Jewish as well as a journalist, and particularly a journalist in that region. And lots of people, Jewish and non-Jewish, made all sorts of assumptions about the sort of job I was going to do, how I was going to tilt the balance, which was variously seen as a good thing or a bad thing, or just the simple, plain physical impossibility of me occupying simultaneous states of being a Jew and a journalist. And the way I dealt with that was basically by just denying it. I mean, in the sense that denying it publicly, just saying the two parts of my identity, Jew and journalist, are entirely separate. We leave all our personal prejudices and beliefs and all the sort of personal stuff at the door when we come to the BBC, which is a very, I mean, listen, it's a good guiding principle. But I actually thought to myself, what is it that I believe? Lots of people are willing to ascribe beliefs to me in all sorts of ways, but what is it that I believe about what it means to be Jewish? And to do that, and this is the point of the book, is that I grew up with not very much family history. I've always been a practicing Jew, but not very much knowledge of my ancestors. We just didn't really know anything about them in any detail. We didn't really have many living relatives. And when I began to scrape away at this buried family history, I discovered this extraordinary gallery spanning centuries and continents of relatives who faced obviously very different challenges to those that confront all of us now, but in their own ways, they had to deal with the challenge of what it means to be Jewish, the struggles that they have, the choices that they could make, sometimes the choices they couldn't make, and how they were interacting inside their families, with their Jewish communities, and in their host societies, because obviously there was a tremendous history of dispossession and exile and people moving and persecution and all that. And so out of that, I looked at their stories, which obviously inform my story, where I come from, but also looked at my own prejudices and beliefs. And out of that, I realized that actually a lot of the way in which I approach my Jewish identity is similar, I hope, to the way in which I approach my journalism, and vice versa, which is that, I try and be questioning about things. I try and have a certain level of humility about things, that we don't know everything. And I try to be pretty honest with myself as well about how much I do know, where I think I'm gathering my information from, and what I do with it. And so actually, to me, it sounds like a sort of comfortable place to end up, but actually I found that the two parts of my identity, my two big parts of my identity as a Jew and as a journalist, were self-reinforcing rather than something that I needed to keep sort of hermetically separated.
Well, you certainly give the impression that you've always striven to be objective in your coverage of the Middle East. And I should just make a disclaimer and acknowledge from the outset that I think that you, Tim, are an outstanding journalist. You're exceedingly fair and balanced in your coverage of the Middle East. And I've been listening to you on NewsHour for more than 5 years. But you've copped criticisms from both sides in the Israel-Palestinian debate. Tell us more.
Well, listen, it goes with the territory. And I sort of, in a sense, one of the ways in which I view the criticism that people make, and they make it in all sorts of ways, as you can imagine, because there's extremely diverse and very strongly held views about what's going on in the Middle East, and particularly with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that, my goodness me, has been going for so many decades. And of course, the last couple of years, it's got to a point where it completely correctly is totally dominating our news. That, in a way, and I don't mean this to sound sort of superficial, but the very fact that people criticize us means, in a sense, that they're paying attention, that they know, when people come up to me and jab their finger in my chest and tell me what they think about the BBC, as they do, it means actually that they care about what the BBC is doing. And my goodness me, it also, as I know I've said to you sort of off camera, they may also have a point. I mean, there may be stuff that we are getting wrong. What I can say with absolute certainty is that there is no agenda. I mean, people do think that we sort of, if you work for the BBC, then you ascribe to a certain worldview, and not only that, but you pursue that agenda deliberately. And undoubtedly, a lot of people who work for the BBC may come with very, very strong personal beliefs about all sorts of things.
Yes,
but there is no overarching.
Well, Tim, you just mentioned in your book a top-ranking French official from a UN agency told you at a diplomats' party in Jerusalem once that, quote, everyone knows Jews run the BBC, and of course the Director General at the time was a Roman Catholic.
He was indeed. It was one of those. It was one of those sort of rather bizarre conversations at a dinner party where, because the hosts were friends, they'd actually just stepped out of the room to sort out the first course. It was one of those arguments where I just decided in the end that it probably really wasn't worth pursuing because I didn't want to embarrass the hosts. But listen.
But then you get this one though, Tim. You've also had a senior minister from a polarising foreign government tell you, quote, your views are extreme and radical, to which you were triggered.
Well, I do say I was slightly triggered. It was after the end of the interview. The mics were off. I mean, there was nothing to be gained. There are there are times when I think, especially these days, when I'm just maybe, and here's the terrible truth for anybody who does want to provoke me, I'm probably slightly less patient with people just saying, listen, they can criticize our output all they like, and they also can say that they don't like my line of questioning all they like, but it's just when they ascribe motive, when they say, well, it's just clear that this is, you're only saying this because this is what you believe. I really do take it very, very seriously, that I hope that people don't, I mean, because ultimately it's not interesting what I believe. If in quotes, what I believe, seeps into the broadcasting, that is, that's poison, and it should never happen. But I really, really strive to listen. My job, and I'm extremely grateful that I've got the job, is to just try and help people understand what's going on in the world a bit more. And part of that is me. It's because I'm interested in what's going on in the world and why it's going on in the world. And so, to try and pursue one particular line, I just think would be traducing all that.
Yeah, a prominent liberal anti-communist intellectual in the post-war period, Sidney Hook, laid down a rule for debate. That is, quote, before you impugn someone's motives, answer their arguments. And I find that when you're interviewing your guests, you're putting to them an argument that they need to respond to. You challenge them, you question, and you do that to both sides of any given issue. But how do you feel about objective journalism generally? Do you think, does that apply to your fellow correspondents in the field there, whether inside or outside the BBC?
By and large, I think it does. And listen, we are a big enough organization that stuff goes wrong, and we're a big enough organization that I'm sure some people do, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, not necessarily adhere to that agenda in the way that I would like. But what I really, really passionately believe, and also believe to be true, is that, there is an argument, and I've heard it, I heard it not so much with the Middle East, but I heard it when Donald Trump came to office during his first term. I heard serious grown-up journalists who, work for proper outlets saying our job is different in the Donald Trump first term because, some of what he says is so, in their words, is so outrageous, so out there, so not pertaining to the facts, that we now have to act in a different way. We can't, in a sense, we can't be objective. We have to be the counterbalancing force to Trump and his believers. I heard it previous to that when the debate over Europe in Britain was going through a particularly neuralgic phase, and a lot of the newspapers, a lot of the most popular newspapers, were very, very anti-European Union. And again, a very prominent broadcaster from it wasn't from the BBC, but from another publicly funded news outlet, said publicly, our job as journalists is to act as a counterweight to those right of centre anti-European newspapers. To which the answer is absolutely not. It's not our job to be campaigners. Our job is to try and explore arguments. And I really, I when it comes to something as sensitive as the Middle East, something as complicated as the Middle East, our job is not to say, well, the balance tilts one way or the other outside, and therefore we have to act as a counterweight.
Well, let's turn briefly to some of the allegations made about the BBC's coverage of the Middle East. This is Danny Cohen. Now, he was a director of television at the BBC around 2013 to 2015, and he published a report earlier this year, Tim, which accuses the BBC's coverage of making, quote, false and damaging claims about Israel's conduct of this war. We'll put a quote up on the screen. This is Danny Cohen, again, formerly with the BBC. Quote, It's truly remarkable how often we are seeing BBC journalists regurgitate the propaganda of a genocidal terrorist organisation without proper journalistic scrutiny, fact-checking, or indeed any kind of due care and attention. It should be shocking to all of us that our national broadcaster gives so much uncritical credence to a murderous terrorist group who build command centres under hospitals and schools and deliberately use the civilian population as human shields. And Danny Cohen goes on to say, too often, BBC journalists want to think the very worst of Israel when they receive information that appears to validate their anti-Israel perspective. The desire to report it without question or proper scrutiny becomes a driving impulse. Tim, what's your response to the likes of Danny Cohen?
There are plenty of people who say that we absorb what they see as their opponents uncritically, and when it comes to Hamas, all I can say is that as far as I'm concerned, and as far as all my colleagues that I know are concerned, when, for example, we talk about the numbers of dead in Gaza, dead and injured in Gaza, that we often refer to out of the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, we do, as far as possible, and I think that's basically pretty much every single time, attribute the figures, for example, this is one very specific example, to the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. Historically, the United Nations and others have said that those figures, which often are the initial figures that come out during wars that have happened in Gaza between Israel and militants there, they turn out to be fairly accurate. We also make the point that Hamas does not distinguish in those figures between militants and civilians in terms of the numbers who have been killed. But yeah, as far as the arguments that Hamas use about the way in which they operate or what Israel is doing in Gaza, we interrogate those as far as possible, as much as possible. So, on the day after October the 7th, I flew out to Tel Aviv on October the 9th. That was the first flight out. But on October the 8th, I happened to be on air with NewsHour. It was Sunday, the day after the attacks. And, I was speaking to a senior Hamas official in Beirut and did an interview which I hope was as hard and as forensic and as tough and as questioning as...
I don't doubt that, but see, the Danny Cohens of the world tuning in would be saying this goes beyond, say, NewsHour, which is by all accounts a very professional media outlet. They would point to other examples. So this is the former British Labour MP Ian Austin saying that BBC Breakfast, News at 10, Newsnight, not NewsHour, Newsnight, all show an astonishing lack of sympathy for Israel. And then, of course, you've got the example I used in my introduction, Tim, where you have the use of a son of a Hamas official to narrate a documentary about the plight of ordinary Palestinians. How does that happen in the first place?
Well, on that, undoubtedly, it was a mistake, and the BBC held up its hands and said, due process was not followed. It should not have got to air. And when they realised what had happened, they pulled the documentary, and there is now an inquiry going on into just how the processes got so wrong. And indeed, listen, there are lots and lots of people who have said, well, nonetheless, this documentary should have aired and should still be available. And, this kid was 14 years old and so on and so forth. So it's not the decision to pull it has also copped a fair bit of criticism. But no, the BBC has acknowledged that was a mistake. And there have been mistakes made in the course of this war, and the way in which it is being reported. There have been incidents that the BBC has got wrong. I think it's just so important. It is so important. I mean, both in terms of the actual incident for us to apologise, but also when things do go wrong.
And it must be so frustrating for someone who is a champion of objective journalism to hear someone like the BBC's best paid presenter, I know he's no longer with the BBC, perhaps because of this, but Gary Lineker, you know the story. Some of our viewers may not. He urged his nearly 9 million followers on X, and this was shortly after October 7, to watch a video in which an academic accused Israel of committing textbook genocide, and that gets all the attention, doesn't it? And that sort of tars the work that the rest of the BBC news reporters and presenters like yourself get tarred with.
Yeah, listen, I mean, it's a continuing bugbear of mine that I do think that, no, but there's some people just, I mean, Gary Lineker is obviously, he wasn't a news reporter, so his status was slightly different, but nonetheless, it all comes together. And I do, people, it's taken people, especially sort of I dare say some of my older generation colleagues like me, who don't necessarily quite understand social media and the idea that, there's no such thing as a sort of private comment, or, if I'm retweeting something, it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily endorsing it, and all the rest of it. We have to be, we're, incredibly lucky that by this accident of history, the BBC does still have a tremendous global reach. And we just have to be so careful about how we protect that tradition. And so, yeah, what we do on social media, how we present ourselves. I mean, it may sound ridiculous, but I am, even just around a table with friends, I'm still incredibly circumspect about what I say, just because it is so deeply ingrained.
Well, indeed. But, back to you say others have described you as a self-hating Jew. I mean, what do you think they mean by that?
Well, I think that they mean that in some way I'm treacherous to Jews because
you're subjecting Israeli cabinet ministers to scrutiny.
That there's that, and there can also be the original sin of working for the BBC. I mean, sometimes on that, as I say, listen, I don't want to suggest that there is no valid criticism. There is plenty of valid criticism, and quite often when people do get in touch with me to criticize something that I have said or a question I have asked, there may be a kernel of truth in it, in terms of, maybe I phrased something badly, I could have done it better. Why did I make those choices? But the problem is just trying to get that out of what then comes out of this sort of huge slag heap of causation about the fact, well, this just goes to show that you are either, parroting the line of the Israeli government, or you're a self-hating Jew, or whatever it is. So it's just, you do have to dissociate some of the psychological analysis that goes on.
And Tim, your Jewish heritage is clearly massively important to you. What was the most remarkable thing you discovered in your own research about your family?
Well, I guess one of the things I would say is that actually that I did have such a huge and varied family tree spanning centuries and continents, because I really grew up not knowing anything about my family history, not because my parents didn't want to tell me, but they didn't really know either. Although, I was born into a very observant Jewish family, and that was partly down to what happened during the Holocaust, of course, but it was also just down to the fact that, they, especially on my mother's side, they hadn't actually gone back that far. And I ended up discovering relatives who were campaigners for civil rights in Curacao, the Dutch West Indies as it was then back in the 19th century, to a itinerant rabbi in Constantinople at the end of the 17th century. And, they were just this gallery of extraordinary characters. I think probably the biggest surprise of the lot was that I was albeit distantly, related to Benjamin Disraeli,
Yes.
the Prime Minister, supposedly Queen Victoria's favorite Prime Minister, who was in some ways perhaps the unlikeliest ever leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, even more so than Margaret Thatcher a century later, because he was, he was born Jewish.
A one nation Tory, right?
He was the father of one nation Toryism. He immensely influential figure, and he was somebody who, he was a practicing Anglican. He was converted by his dad when he was a kid, but he came from a family that was, I discovered, my family. And that was the other slight surprise, was that actually in discovering my relationship to him, I mean, he's a cousin, third cousin, so not that close, but nonetheless, it actually, it went against what has been the established view of biographers and historians of Disraeli going back decades. So it was I'm slightly hesitant about saying this because I'm not a historian, but what I seem to have uncovered actually is a new part to Disraeli, but it just goes to so much of some of the very frankly toxic views that he had about the mystique and power of Jews, and it was just fascinating for me to explore that and how seductive it's been for generations of biographers.
Well, look, we're recording this exchange right at the aftermath of the US strike on Tehran, and viewers would not expect you, as I say, you're one of the fairest and most balanced presenters at the British public broadcaster, Tim. They wouldn't expect you to give your own views on whether the Israeli attacks on Iran are justified and whether the recent US decision to join those attacks are justified. This is a recent Charles Moore critique of the BBC to you. Now, Charles Moore is a former long-time editor of the UK Daily Telegraph and the UK Spectator, and we'll put this Charles Moore quote on the screen. He suggests the BBC is drawing a sort of moral equivalence between Iran and Israel. The BBC, quote, does not remind us that Israel attacked because it is the policy of Iran to destroy it, and it has nearly reached the nuclear capacity to do so. Nor does the BBC mention that most of the Iranian attacks target civilians, whereas none of the Israeli ones do. Is that a fair criticism from Charles Moore? How would you respond to him?
Well, again, I can't talk about every single minute that is broadcast on the BBC across our multiple channels. But what I do know is that all that I have heard, seen, and read, heard and listened to and read, and I would hope that does. I know you said don't take it personally, but I hope that does include my own broadcasting. Is that we talk absolutely, and we when we speak to people from Iran, we challenge them about their nuclear program, about the fact that the Islamic Republic's sworn aim has been to destroy Israel since 1979, and also, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we talk about where Israeli strikes have hit, and where Iranian strikes have hit, and what is being targeted. And it's certainly, as far as Israel is concerned, some of those targets, I mean, they said just on Monday that some of the targets they were going after were not so much nuclear targets as regime targets, as they put it. And some of those regime targets are in Tehran, which is a very densely packed, huge city. And, we know for a fact that there have been people who are not members of the regime who have been caught up in that. So I think, look, it is perfectly fair that people say that what they see and hear in some of our output doesn't tally with their view of how the story should be reported. And we look at those criticisms, seriously. But I do think that there is not, I don't think the idea that the BBC goes into reporting with any sense of sort of moral equivalence, as Charles Moore puts it, I really hope that that is not the case.
Yeah, well, on that note, do you feel the contribution of Jewish people to countries such as Britain, where there are considerable communities of Jews, is it appreciated? Is it underappreciated? And if so, why?
I don't know if it's underappreciated. And I mean, I should say that, you know, although I now live in London, where there is a reasonably sized Jewish community. I mean, Jews, as Jews are globally, I mean, they are an absolutely sort of minuscule proportion of the population. And I grew up in Birmingham, which is the second city, population of, you know, getting on for 2 million. There were 900 Jewish families when I was growing up. So, you know, it really was, we were an infinitesimal minority growing up there. In terms of, is it underappreciated? I'm not sure. I think it's a microcosm of what a lot of people feel about Jews around the world, which is some people think that they, you know, if they do want to make generalized judgments, they think that Jews have contributed in an outsized way, and there are others who think that Jews have contributed balefully in an outsized way, that they have undue influence and that they're running things, like that French diplomat who thought
Yes.
that Jews run the BBC. I mean, you know, Jews get an awful lot of attention. They bring a lot of attention on themselves, and sometimes that's for good, and sometimes that is definitely for ill.
Well, Tim, it's lovely to chat with you, and thanks so much for being a guest here at the Centre for Independent Studies.
It's been a huge pleasure for me, Tom. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the fact that you listen to NewsHour.
That was Tim Franks. He's a long-time presenter of NewsHour on the BBC World Service. His book is called The Lines We Draw, The Journalist, the Jew, and an Argument about Identity. That's published by Bloomsbury.